Hello, my name is Dan Hennen. Today is March 3rd, 2019, and we've got a Crowley case update today. Joining with ourselves is going to be Greg Fernandez Jr. Welcome, Greg.
Hey, Dan.
And Catherine Michele.
Hi, Dan. Hi, Greg.
So we got three of us here, and we haven't done a broadcast here for a while. We wanted to get everyone up to date and put into context, I guess, the connection of the Crowley case along with the neighbor, the Prochnow family, and in particular the neighbor Judy. And so what we've got is there are a lot of people I've noticed with the new members on the group is the common question. And sorry, I've got a little bit of a cold here if I'm a little hoarse. The question is how has or why has a neighbor such as Judy Prochnow in this particular case, as a 66-year-old grandmother, inserting herself into a crime scene like this, into a crime, the aftermath, I should call it, not the scene itself, but the aftermath. For instance, the Justice for David Crowley page, the group, leaving comments and various things on the YouTube channels, and why is she so active? So I think we're going to cover some ground on that today, and just going over some of the, and I'll call them anomalies, for instance, the 911 call and things like that went on, and which leads some to believe that some of these things were done on purpose, or were they just done unwittingly by a neighbor that's just well-meaning. The good jumping off point today would be that 911 dispatch call from Judy. So let's start there. I know that before the police, when the police were called, it was Colin went next door, looked in the window, saw what he believed to be mannequins, and came home. And then Judy says, well, what's the deal with that? Let's go back and take a closer look together, because I don't think there'd be mannequins there. And they found the bodies. What proceeded next in this Crowley case is started right off the bat. What I would call is confusion or disorientation. We get a 911 call placed by Judy. And then Colin calls a few minutes later also to 911 dispatch. Thoughts on that, on the fact that there's two phone calls, Catherine?
To me, that just tells me that they obviously were not paying attention to what the other one was doing. That, to me, I find odd, especially since Colin was the one who first saw them. But yeah, and the fact that it seemed to me, I'm trying to find that document right now, that the operator, the 911 operator, was in a hurry to kind of get Colin off the line. And it's like, well, your wife is on the other line. We already talking to him, which I found was kind of odd to begin with, because you want as much information as you can. And yes, I understand that they knew someone was already on their way and they had a call coming in. But he seemed to be at first trying to give some information, but they just kind of cut him off. Like, we've already got your wife on the line, leave,
Their calls are very, very different too.
Yeah, I'd like to get into that here to kick things off, because we've had other people that are either police or EMT or 911 dispatch callers or in some form law enforcement, and they go into how common and how important it is, I guess, to listen to the actual words or the phrases used by the initial 911 caller. A typical reporting party or the RP will call and be frantic and stumbling upon what it is they're doing, and not very coherent, as they're just as what I would call that as an authentic 911 caller. Now, Judy's phrases and terminology are very different than just an authentic person reporting facts. She gets into some very strange details for someone noticing the bodies of three bodies. And so I think the difference is here, then I'll ask, Greg, I'll ask you for your thoughts here first, but when Colin calls, he keeps things in generalities and very generic, general things. He says, there are 3 dead bodies next door, please send someone. And that was really it. That would be a typical 911 call, not going into other things. Judy, now the wife, goes into saying that there is an animal, a dog in the house, and it looks like the heads are missing, and the dog has been eating the heads of the people. She also goes on to say that there's 3 dead bodies, and it looks like either a murder or a suicide took place. Mm-hmm. And so that's usually not something reserved for the caller of 911 to start determining what they think happened. Their job is just to simply call and report what they've found, exactly like what Colin Prochnow did. 3 dead bodies, please send someone out, here's the address, done deal. Now, Judy, on the last thing, goes on to say further that the bodies have been in the house for several weeks, because she tells the 911 dispatcher that there's Christmas gifts left on the front stoop since before Christmas. Now, the call came in on January 17th of 2015, which is a Saturday afternoon, roughly 1 p.m. on the afternoon, and she goes out of her way to say that the gifts were there for 3 weeks. So, what are your thoughts, Greg, by someone giving that amount of information to a simple 911 dispatcher who's just simply answering the call and sending out the appropriate personnel to the scene? What are your thoughts about the differences between those various 911 information they sent to dispatchers?
I think she's speculating way too much. She should not be speculating, should not be worried about if it's a murder or a suicide, if the dog ate these bodies, all of that stuff. When you look at the way that Colin calls them and you look at the way that she calls them, in the first sentence, she's already telling them things. She's leading them. She's putting thoughts into their head that don't need to be put there. What should be happening is what they ask, you tell them. Okay, tell them what you see, not what you think. And I think a lot of this is her telling them what she thinks, and it's too early on. And she even mentions dummies here. She's, and I mean, it's way too early for her to be talking about dogs eating bodies. Anybody who's seen one photo of those bodies can clearly tell that, at least from what I've seen, I don't think it's, if I look through a window, I'm not going to start saying, oh, well, they look like a dog ate them.
Correct. I would have thought the same thing you just said. There's no way for you to even jump to that conclusion. And, right, what she says right here, the dispatcher says, they're asking where her house is, and they go, so to the right, and what are you seeing in there? And she writes, it just looks like there's a pile of bodies, and one like the head is eaten off. I suppose by the dog, and my husband thought they were dummies, but the hands look real. And it's like, really? Why would you even say that? Why jump to that right away?
Yeah,
they're talking about all this stuff before Christmas, right?
Yeah, she says the phrase before Christmas it's very telling that you use the word before Christmas, which there's no evidence of that at all.
Yeah, because in the typed out transcript, it says inaudible what the operator asked her, and then her response is, and they would have been there since before Christmas. It's like, how would you know you were gone? I don't know.
Now, just for the new members out there, we do have the differing stories that came out in the Star Tribune, which is the local Minneapolis paper, that says that the brother dropped off the gifts on the 26th or the 27th. And we know there was some speculation there. We also have the official police reports since the case was closed saying that David's brother, Dan Crowley Jr., dropped the gifts off on the 28th. And then we've got some speculation of neighbors and whatnot that appears that the gifts were there no longer than a week's. Maybe they were dropped off the first or second week of January. But in no instance was there ever gifts there before Christmas. So I think that's just and I think it would be hard to explain that as just a slip of the lip and, out came the wrong thing. But she was really stretching there when she said the word before Christmas, because that really leads the dispatcher down a path of, it's planting the seed.
Yes, and she says it twice. Before they were talking about the bodies, and now they're talking in this next part. The dispatcher says you saw presence inside the home too. She says there's presence on the front step, and they've been there since before Christmas. And
that's not possible. That's not possible. Of course it's possible, but that totally contradicts what David's brother says and when he dropped those presents off.
And yes, and then from what the neighbors say, that's the thing I wanted to add, is almost every single neighbor stated in their, when they were interviewed by the police, that they didn't notice anything on the doorstep until January 10th.
Now, this is also strange because of where their actual mailboxes are. So for Judy to go and get her mail, they have to walk past David's house.
Correct.
So you're telling me for 3 weeks they didn't see any they saw the presents there before Christmas, or they've been there, and then when they leave town, then that was the last time that they saw those presents there? I don't know. Something's missing here. Definitely more to it.
So it's it's what I would call planting the seeds or sowing the seeds of it's planting the seeds of little information tidbits, almost that one could argue that she's rattling off to 911 dispatch as bullet points to get those different various thoughts in their heads so they can start thinking down that route, rather than just, like Catherine says, you simply should be answering questions from the dispatch, not going forward and telling all of this outside speculation.
Well,
yes, and all of those seeds grew into some big freaking ugly trees that we're still trying to chop down right now.
Exactly, and the police just took what she said and ran with it. That's my take. Okay, my personal take is the police heard that on the call, and as they were driving out, the audio of them going out there and being told that there are 3 bodies or whatever, and then from that moment, not once in any of their reports were they saying they're going to look for a possible triple homicide. Their comments were always, it's a murder-suicide. So they were absolutely biased from the get-go. And we were talking, too, about, because everybody says, well, didn't anybody notice or didn't anybody see the writing on the wall? And then Judy has said in the past, or other people, I'm not sure if it was Judy or if it was other people, where they were saying that, no, there weren't any lights on except for Christmas lights. But right here, the dispatcher is asking her, okay, and you haven't seen, and then Judy just cuts him off and says, and all their Christmas lights are still on in the house. And that's where my husband saw the gun. And if there are a lot of Christmas lights on, it's going to be bright enough for someone to see in.
I've got the timeline here pulled up, and just also for the new members of the group listening, it does show that Judy calls 911 at 12:56 p.m. and speaks with a male dispatcher from her cell phone. And it was a minute later, I think it's 12:57, is that when Colin Procknell called from the house phone. And so they were overlapping on their phone calls at that point. Now, like you had said, the neighbors don't have, all the neighbors on that street don't have police testimony, essentially, saying that they were looking at these gifts or they have seen these gifts sitting there for an extended period of time. They all said that they may have been there up to a week, roughly. And what we do know for sure is that when Colin and Judy left for their trip to Florida, they left on Saturday, January 10th, for a trip to Orlando. And they saw packages on the front stoop at that point when they left. And so that's the first time that we actually have evidence, if you want to call it that the gifts were there. So the gifts were for sure there when they backed out of the driveway to go to the airport to Orlando. So that would put it at a week for sure. They could have certainly been there longer, but they didn't look weathered or anything else. So maybe they were just there a week, but they certainly weren't there longer. And then when they got back from their trip on the 14th of January, this was a Wednesday, they returned in the evening in Minneapolis on a return flight on that Wednesday. And then when they pulled into their driveway, they saw the gift still sitting there. And that's what prompted them to make note that they were still there. Then a couple days passed. On that Saturday, that's when Colin went over to do some checking because of the gifts. But you're right, no other neighbors said that the gifts were there for 3 weeks, 3-week time frame.
Yeah, and I'm right now, which is interesting too, I'm reading Colin's response when he made the 911 call. And he says, and we were out of town, and I'm reading directly what's on the thing, the first week in January, and when we left, the presents were there, the front step, and I told my wife, I didn't notice them the other day because I didn't look, but I said I'm going to run over and see if those presents are still there, and they are. So it's like, did you see them or did you not see them?
Yeah, they would have gotten in January at their arrival time was a 5:39 flight into Minneapolis on that Wednesday. So they would have gotten back. It would have certainly been dark, so they would not have probably noticed the gifts. So then when they checked, then he went back and checked on Saturday. But they were there on the 10th when they left. Now the other thing I'd like to get both of your takes on the television interview of this of this double homicide followed by a suicide allegedly in the news. TV crews interviewed Colin and Judy in their home on TV, but they were only interviewed from the neck down or from the chest down, essentially not showing either of their faces. And we see that commonly if there's a killer on the loose or if there's a bad guy out there, they don't want to show their faces. But do you know why Colin and Judy would have elected just to have the video show from the chest down in their home by TV interviewers?
Yeah, and she had made a comment to someone that the reason why they weren't showing their faces was because they had just woke up and supposedly the news crews came by unannounced and they hadn't brushed their hair or brushed their teeth or anything like that. And my response to that, to her, is usually they don't just show up on your door. And if they do, you can simply request and say, now's not a good time, but can you give us an hour or two? And we would be happy to do the interview with you. And then take that time to get yourself ready, if that is truly what happened. But just to say, oh, well, okay, come on in, but don't show our faces. And then all of a sudden, insert yourself in every aspect of the case like you knew them. And you had to even, Judy, in this instance I'm talking about, she didn't even know David's address. She had to ask her husband.
They live next door.
Yeah, and she lives right next door to him. So it's like, okay, she didn't know them. They just looked in and supposedly only saw the bodies, but yet now she's an expert on this case. And I'm just like, none of that makes sense to me.
Mm-mm.
Yeah, it was. The police were called. It was January 17th of 2015, and then things were relatively quiet after that article came out in the video and the news and the image of their interview from the chest down, oddly enough. And then social media didn't pick up until Valentine's Day. It was February 14th of 2015. So just coming up on a month later, that is when Judy Prochnow began jumping on to social media and talking about the case, discussing the case, commenting on the case, and giving analysis on the case. And all those things came out of the blue. And like you said, Catherine, almost like she was talking as an expert figure or an expert on the case, mm-hmm. or a very close family friend or a very close family neighbor. But Judy was none of those things. And so that's what really piqued people's interest when their radar went off. And now coupling that with looking back on that 911 call, where she's conveniently planting seeds to the dispatch. Who knows what's really going on here, but it certainly does not seem to be the actions of just a simple neighbor that has no interest in this case.
Right, because most people, their first response wouldn't be, oh, I think it's a murder or a suicide. You would just say, I don't know. I think there are bodies in there. We're not sure. My husband thinks it's a mannequin. Can you get somebody over here? They're not answering the door. We're scared. I don't really know them. But instead, it's like, you know, and of course we're only reading the transcript and we don't hear how she's saying it. I would love to hear how she's actually stating these words, because that would tell us a whole heck of a lot. But the fact that even in her interview with the police, and the police asked for David and Camille's phone number, she didn't know it. They had to go to the other neighbor because the other neighbor knew them and had their personal cell phone numbers. So for someone who, A, didn't know their address, B, didn't even have a cell phone number for them, and C, admits that she never talked to them, all of a sudden, now, for all these years, has so much to say, and she's such an expert on the case. And okay, I'm sorry, maybe I'm being accusatory here, and I don't mean to be, but it frustrates me that she constantly inserts herself and spreads untruths about the case all the time. And she's just like, well, I'm the neighbor, I was there. Well, I don't care if you're the neighbor. You don't know what you're talking about.
Yeah, it got to be. Okay, go ahead, Greg.
I was just going to say, since she is the neighbor, she should know what she's talking about. So it's even more weird that she doesn't, and that her stories continually change, and that she'll say one thing now, change her story, and it's just like the truth does not need to be changed. You don't need to hide. You know, it does not change. And so her stories and her changing stories lead me to think that she's not telling the truth.
I agree.
Yeah, I think that 911 call was also of shock value, because everything that she mentioned was it's not exaggerated, but it was over the top. The dogs, the dog eating the bodies. There for many weeks, several weeks, and then she ends the whole thing by saying, you know what, I have to go now because I think I'm going to vomit. And so it's all of this hyperbole, essentially, all on one phone call, especially for someone that didn't know the family too well. And then later she said, I think there was a comment about the scene was a biohazard scene. And she said, yes, it was, because I saw people walking in with hazmat suits on. And Catherine, what's your take on that potentially?
They did not go in with biohazard suits. So to me, that was probably the cleaning crew. And their standard uniforms are, they usually wear like a white, they're like white coveralls head to toe with a mask, because the smell of decay is pretty strong. And so until they get in and they clean up the blood or the decomp fluids or stuff, it is just standard operating procedure for them to wear coveralls head to toe. It doesn't mean anything. It's just their work uniform. And I'm like, okay, yeah, no, it wasn't a hazmat in the sense that it was something really horrible, but you just wear that to get the initial cleanup done, and then they will take that off once the blood is off, which there wasn't a lot of blood, but once the blood or the carpet is removed or something like that, then they take that stuff off and then continue their cleaning.
Yeah, it's very, very interesting. I know that when she first came on the page, it was February 14th, but her reasoning was to help clear the air and to, quote, to defend the family, because there was conspiracy talk and wild, outlandish theories were going on. Now, a typical neighbor that doesn't know this family, I think, would probably care less if there was conspiracy theories being talked about or theories being suggested on the page. Now, secondly, if she's there to defend the family, she also didn't know, and she's alluding to here the Crowley family.
Correct.
The parents, David's parents, both lived in Owatonna, about a 45-minute drive away. So she wouldn't have known even the extended family of them. So she also wouldn't care necessarily to be able to defend the family, because she didn't know them. So that's another radar that goes up, the antenna that gets raised by other people that I talk to, by saying people that I talk to say, if my neighbors were gruesomely murdered and there was people talking online, social media about that, why would I care what they were saying? Why would that even interest me? Why would it interest me so much to jump onto social media and use 12 to 15 different Facebook account profiles to get my point across. Obviously, you're not well liked or respected, so leave it alone. But yet, like we said, she keeps on coming back and back and back, almost as if she has an agenda, a goal, some kind of process she's trying to meet. She's trying to do something, and the question is, what is that something? Now, when the case came out a year later, when it was finalized, there was a very large response on social media to a People article, People magazine. People.com website had the big major article, and I think Judy spent the better portion of 2 days on the comments section responding to questions from all over the world about this case, and that's where she proceeded to, she became infamous for saying on those pages that the living room sofa was pushed up against that picture window in the living room. That's why the dog Paleo jumped up, and that's how he was up there. We know that wasn't true. She said that the dining room lights were not on in the house, but the crime scene photos showed that the dining room lights were on. So there's various stories that were wrong that we later alluded to the fact that were either misinformation or disinformation. And the difference between that is misinformation is just someone making a mistake and saying something incorrectly. Disinformation is really when you're doing it on purpose to lead someone down the wrong path, lead someone down the wrong track. That's disinformation. And so what people have thought after reading her dozens of posts on those comments on the People magazine site is that, is she spreading misinfo or is she spreading disinfo? And the question that I received from many people who instant messaged me by saying a neighbor with no connection would simply be spreading neither of those things. They wouldn't care.
Right.
So why would she be that interested to be spending a couple days on the comments section to set the story straight when she wasn't part of the crime or connected to the crime at all? So that really piqued a lot of people's interest once that story came out, and that was January of 2016.
Yeah, and at first, I would have given her the benefit of the doubt, and I kind of tried to, because I'm like, well, maybe it was misinformation. Maybe she just didn't understand. But then when she goes and replies to one of my videos and states that that I didn't know what I was talking about, and they had found body parts or head pieces or something. I have to find that little comment. Where she says, actually the skulls were found and David's was shattered into several pieces. In one photo, there's a small bone that looks like it could be an arm bone lying on the floor, broken of nod. There were body parts scattered throughout the house. No, there weren't, and so because she does stuff like this, she from the very beginning, she didn't know them. She didn't know their phone number. She clearly states had no clue who they were. And now she's jumping into saying that there were possibly an arm bone. It could be, well, she says it could be an arm bone lying on the floor. There were no arm bones spoken of in any of the reports. There's no bone big enough to be an arm bone. And then that there were absolutely not body parts scattered throughout the house. So to me, it went from where she could be doing not understanding and giving out misinformation to absolute deliberate disinformation.
I don't understand why she's even saying that unless she's seen photos, unless somebody is telling her that or feeding her talking points, which seems like many of the talking points that she has it matches some of the talking points that a lot of other people have too. And yet when they're pushed, they really don't know what they're talking about because they don't have any evidence to prove David Crowley guilty. It's just circles and circles and circles, just focusing on these wedge things, focusing on these small things that would create doubt in somebody's head. And it just goes back, it's a psychological thing. Everything that she's doing from the very start of this call, from a psychological view, you can see exactly what she's doing. And you can see exactly what Colin Prochnow is not doing. And one of them seems real to me, and the other one seems very strange.
Correct. I would agree with that, and I would use the word authentic. I think Colin's 911 call to dispatch was an authentic one that a normal person would make. Judy's was certainly not that, and was giving information. And then, like you said, to go as far as to say I don't want our faces, shown for this TV interview, to try to not be a public figure essentially, or not be in the limelight, to reverse that a simple month later and to go full bore on social media on all of these different venues or arenas between YouTube. And then she was on my YouTube page the other day commenting under Colin Procknell's YouTube account, which is very strange, but it certainly was her. But I mean, it just seems to be very strange to have that much, number one, time on your hands, and number two, that much interest. Now, since this whole case went down, she has gone on and allegedly becoming friends with Sean Wright. I think she's been talking with, I'm not sure if it was Mason Hendricks, but she's in communication with some of these folks that are actors in the case. And that seems odd to me, why she would be conversing with, being friends with, talking with anyone relating to the Gray State Project itself. But she certainly has done that, which is very odd. It's a very strange scenario. And like Greg said, from the very beginning, from that initial 911 call is when this all got to be strange, and most of it fell squarely onto the doings of Ms. Procknell.
Yeah, exactly. And, here she goes from someone who has zero interest in this family, and David had been working on this film for quite some time. They had been actually shooting scenes, and she knew nothing about it, never inserted herself into their life before. And now all of a sudden, once they're all dead, and in my belief and from the evidence I have seen, they were all three murdered. This was not a suicide in any way, shape, or form, but she is really pushing that narrative, and then does become buddy-buddy with Sean Wright. Now, if I were a neighbor, even somebody I don't know, if I didn't know them or I did know them, and there would be something really odd about a murder, I would question it, and I certainly wouldn't become someone's best friend. And I'm not saying she's best friends, but the way she talks is like, oh, no, she has the inside scoop, and we don't know. And I'm like, wow, why? What are you gaining from stating this? What are you gaining from inserting yourself? And it doesn't matter who says something. She inserts herself into that person's thought process on the case. And either she agrees with them or she tells them that they're lying if it doesn't go with her agenda or the written agenda. And it just doesn't make sense.
The same thing was done with when the alleged journal came out. She was one of the first to allegedly read it or have possession of it or see it, and then she started saying that yes, it proves that David did this because of what the contents of this journal show exactly what happened. Now, if I was police or investigators, I'm not sure why I would be showing this journal to the neighbor. Why would you wouldn't? Why would she see the journal? Anyway, is the question, I guess.
Yeah, you wouldn't. And I talked to a couple of my police friends, and when she made that comment, and I went and I talked to a couple of my police friends, and I'm like, hey, this is the narrative now. And their response was, we don't care if they flat out wrote, I'm going to kill myself and I'm going to kill my family. They go, unless you walk in and there's evidence that is what happened, it's just writing. You don't take off with that and go, oh, okay, well, it's written there, so now they're guilty. If the evidence doesn't support what was written, you have to go with the evidence. And so they said in their mind, the diaries and the notebooks or whatever, the journals, would mean nothing. They would strictly look at the entire scene. And so how can they state that the journals support a murder-suicide, yet none of the electronics devices, none of his emails, none of his writings on his computer, they could find no motive whatsoever? I'm thinking that if the journals had and did say something like that, then that would be considered motive. But they flat out state in their reports they could find no motive for David to do this. So here Judy is spreading, again, disinformation about a motive and why David did this. She has no clue.
But she did, wasn't there a $200 bet at one point?
Yeah, she told, because I did a video on the knife position, because I found it interesting that throughout the police reports, the knife was located in 3 separate areas, according to the drawings. And the fact that I found it interesting that they have a knife with all 3 victims' blood on it, but yet it was never tested for latent prints, and the police just ignored it, the knife at the scene. And so she said, well, I'll pay anyone $200 if you can prove to me that, the knife is even mentioned, because Catherine's lying and blah, blah, blah. So then I did a follow-up, and I posted the photos of the police drawings of the knife. And I'm like, okay, where's my $200? Here it is in the police reports. And, she never has paid up, by the way. And she says she doesn't have to because it's not written. And I'm like, wow. Yeah, no. And so how would she know? I swear she hasn't even read the reports, because if she had, she would know that all this stuff is in there.
Yeah, that's correct. Now, right away at the beginning, in the interview process with police, it was Judy that said that my husband, heard allegedly gunshots coming from that, neighborhood or that part of that area where the Crowley house lives in the weeks before the shooting. So I think police started to chase down those leads of when the gunshots were, but they were earlier in the month of December, and then at I think it was the 3rd week in December. And so the bodies, they had come to the conclusion the bodies were killed sometime Christmas Eve or Christmas Day or after that, and they had it narrowed down to at the very end that Colin's gunshot that he allegedly heard was the evening of the 18th or the 19th or the early morning hours of the 20th or something. But it was in all irrelevant of when he heard anything, because none of those matched up at all. But it seemed like she kept trying to insert when the gunshots, and then her husband heard them. The question is, is Colin an unwitting victim in this whole thing? Does he not know what his wife is doing on these social pages, and her using, his YouTube account, for instance? I hope, she certainly didn't create a YouTube account with his name on it, so I'm just assuming that she's using his. But I'd like to know what his thoughts and his, beliefs are of her behavior, because, like we said, this is 4 years now going strong, and there are some things that people write or post, and within 15 minutes later, Judy is hot on the case because she knows it. She knows about it. So she's monitoring these pages or these channels, or someone else is relaying this information back to her. And what are your thoughts on those types of scenarios as far as the response time? I mean, it doesn't, 15 minutes don't go past when something gets out there unfavorable to her, and she either knows about it, or I think, wasn't she even the one who knew about the Reddit blog, the subreddit about the Crowley case? I think Judy said that she stumbled upon that by Butterfly Rises, I think, before anyone else on the Justice pages even saw the subreddit. So very interesting as what I would consider it, that she's first on the case for anything to do with David Crowley on the internet.
Yeah, because I heard about the Reddit thing from Judy from reading her comments. I didn't even know about it. But yeah, Greg, what do you think about all that?
She's right on the case. Yeah, she's definitely. She's like their freaking cleanup. She's their cleanup crew. It's the same thing that Sean Wright was doing back then. It's the same program. So yeah. I'm not saying they're both working together.
Not in cahoots. Yeah.
Right. There's no collusion, no proof of collusion, but correct. There is something. What they're doing, their actions. It's their actions that have raised questions. It's not because they're great people and because they really care about these families and because we're bad people and we just don't care and we just are in it for our own goals. It's not
and that's
that,
the thing and that's the thing I just don't understand. It's like, here we have proof. We have found proof David was murdered. We want his name cleared because he's innocent and the real murderers are out there. And instead of her being excited and saying, wow, you guys are doing this for our neighbors, and I really cared about them, and were they killed instead of what we were told it was or what I thought it was. Instead of that, she is defending and then attacking, literally attacking verbally everything else, with videos and pictures and the little nasty comments they made, anybody who shows proof that David is innocent. Now, how can you be just a neighbor and be just an innocent bystander and have no agenda, yet at the same time, that's all you do is put out an agenda? And it's interesting you made the comparison. My interactions with Sean Wright truly are no different than they are with Judy, except for Judy doesn't use the extensive foul language that Sean Wright uses. Other than that, they're exactly the same. Attack, attack, attack. And it's like, go ahead, you can be angry all you want, but it's not going to change the facts of the case. And so instead of supporting the facts, they're pushing a narrative. And I don't understand.
And they're not telling us why David is guilty. They're not giving anybody any reason to believe that David is guilty.
Correct.
There's just so even if people don't like what we say about the reasons and the facts and everything why David is not guilty, they can't produce anything to counter it. It's just all of these weird little small issues that really don't go back to the fact that say, well, you know what, this is why David Crowley is guilty. It should be very simple. It should be very plain. And at this point, there's so many people that are still trying to hold on to this fictitious thing that there's some evidence out there that proves David Crowley is guilty. That is a complete lie. There is nothing out there.
Yeah. I mean, that is so true. And how easy would it be? And instead of saying, okay, here it is, here's what we think, they still go back on the attack even more and have never once produced anything. Or it's the old, well, the family showed it to me, but I can't tell anybody because you guys are so mean. No, I think you're lying. End of story.
So what are your two thoughts, I guess, for Catherine and Greg, as far as, was that 911 call an authentic reaction from a cause-effect relationship? So a cause, they see the bodies, and the effect is they make a 911 call. Do you both believe that that actually happened that way, I guess? And if so, what level? 100%, 80%, or?
That's a tough question. That's a really tough one, because you never want to accuse somebody, of, and every person is different. And I've had people try to tell me what they would do if they were me, and I'm like, well, that's not what I would do, or that's not how I would think. So I definitely see both sides of it. I see all sides of it, but I don't understand. And I think at the very least, I would hope that people would see this and see what she says here and don't do this. Do what Colin did. Look at, it's a big, big difference. Don't do what Judy did. It's not a good way. It does not help. It does not help people that are showing up to that scene. It doesn't help them.
Well, all the scenes that we used to go to, we would get calls, just for example, and we had a call come in, stabbing, and the person was really super hysterical, and they're like, okay, they were stabbed in the neck, they're bleeding, and the blood is squirting everywhere, and we need help, and literally just hysterical on the phone. There's blood everywhere. And so we're like, okay, so we get the call, we're jumping in, And the paramedic and I were going back and forth, and he's like, okay, you need to tell me what, because on the way to a scene, we generally discuss what we're going to do when we get there. And so he's quizzing me, and when we finally get to the scene, we're prepared for this really bad injury, right? And we come walking in, and we're looking at each other, and we're like, where's the patient? Oh, on the couch. And we saw somebody lying on the couch, and he was just sitting there talking, and we're like, where? Because we're expecting to see blood squirting and someone super hurt. And this guy had a small scratch on his neck. It wasn't even bleeding. It was a scratch. And, I mean, so people will be hysterical, and they tend to lose it. But the exaggeration on that part was not, if neighbor stabbed him, and it was just, they got crazy. They got scared because someone got hurt. Now, when she's making this phone call, and she doesn't even know anybody, and then she's like, it just looks like a pile of bodies, and one like the head is eaten off. You can't see that from where she's standing outside looking in. Why was that where she went to? And then to say, I suppose by the dog. And I'm like, that to me is not normal. That would not be a normal response. You would just simply say, I don't know, and I can't tell. It looks like, maybe a head is missing. And I could hear that. I could understand that. But to jump right in, first off, and say, oh, I think it's a murder or a suicide. Oh, no, wait, it looks like the head is eaten off. What? No, that to me is not a normal response at all.
Yeah, that's Yeah, and that's it. Go ahead, Greg.
She sees everything. She sees everything except for this gun. That's the one thing that she doesn't make clear that she actually sees. She says Colin saw it.
Right.
She saw everything else, and she could picture everything else that happened within this scene. Right? She's played it all out, but she didn't see the actual gun. She also doesn't mention the blood writing, too.
On the wall. Correct.
Yeah.
And that would have been the first thing I would have noticed. When you first look in, you're going to be looking around. Why look straight to a floor? I mean, I would look around going, okay, what's going on? Well, that
should have been mentioned.
Yeah.
Should have been mentioned. If they could see it. Now, if they could see it from that view.
Well, if they could see a head eaten off, quote unquote, when actually there were, they were not at an advanced stage of decomp. I mean, yes, some of the head was because, as it turns out, most of their heads were missing. So it would decompose faster in those areas, which does not give indication of time of death. But you can't see that because it would be blending in with either the floor or the shadows. But if it's bright enough in that house for her to see that much detail, then it would have been bright enough to see the writing on the wall.
Yeah, I would think so. I don't know so because I haven't actually stood out there. I know Dan has, so he definitely knows more on that.
Oh, sorry, I was on mute. What was the last question?
That's okay.
Since you looked in the house, if you can see something on the floor, would you be able to see the writing on the wall?
Yeah, I don't believe so, unless you would, look in that direction. It was farther off to the left. It wasn't just right there next to the, not on the wall. It's maybe 10 or 15 feet farther to the left. So if you would have looked in and saw that the first image there on the floor, I don't think you would have gone to the next level to say, I'm going to look around and see what else I can see.
But
that's what I think. I think it was more of a shock factor.
But see, that was part of my point. The first thing you do when you look in a window, and the only reason I know this is because I have a glass opening on the front of my door, and when people come up to my door, I sit back and I watch them looking in my house, and it happens quite often. The first place people look is not down. They're looking around. They look around the living room, and they're looking up here. And I'm sitting there staring at them, so that's how I'm picturing this. If they first went up there to look inside this house, you're going to put your face up to the window and you're going to be looking in going, okay, what's going on? You're going to be looking at walls, at the kitchen, the first place you don't do is just put your face up to the window, look at the floor, and stop. I have never seen anyone do that. So the whole, well, all we saw was bodies right away, I don't buy that. I just don't buy it.
I think Catherine, the height of it when you're at that window looking in, it's elevated. That first floor is elevated, and so that's the first thing I think you're going to see closest to you is the floor. It's not, you're not on the same level as the sidewalk outside.
Okay, well,
it's three or four.
I think I should look at the pictures.
Three or four steps up, so it's elevated. So you're very close to, your head's at the bottom of the window essentially.
Right. And so you would have to step on your, I mean, even though the floors, because from the angle of the pictures that I remember, there's probably, maybe 2.5 feet between the floor and the windowsill. So even standing there, if you're looking in, you're still going to have a broader range of the, say, maybe the middle of the house. And you're going to be looking around saying, well, do I see anybody? It's not like when they first look in, the floor is at eye level. They're still going to have to look down. But yeah, so I don't know. Just everything about that has never made sense to me. Not their phone calls, not how they called 911, not how they found the bodies, not how they described them without describing anything else. You know, it's really odd.
I think the other thing to consider is this 911 call not coming, as a result of seeing the bodies, but as a potentially a plan B. If these bodies were meant to be discovered when the Prochnow family was away in Florida, it would have been very convenient for all parties. Friends, family, neighbors, someone would have discovered the bodies. When they returned on Wednesday and they were still there, what if this was a plan B? They wait a couple days and then someone gave them the green light to say, you know what, now you need to make that call because it didn't go as planned. That could be the explanation why the strange 911 call, because she already had the bullet points of what needed to be said. She had what was scripted to tell them, which if that is the case, you're no longer dealing with someone on the cover-up end of a crime, but on the front end with knowledge about the actual crime itself. So was that potentially the reason that they were out of town for those 4 or 5 days, conveniently gone while the gifts were there, while the bodies were there? Thoughts on that?
That's possible. That's definitely possible.
Yeah, I wouldn't rule anything out right now. And the only reason I say that is because of her behavior since in the last 4 years. To go from someone who didn't know them to now she's an expert and she's forcing a narrative. To me, it's like, okay, so why was it so convenient for you, and why did you make that phone call? And why didn't you make a phone call before you left? So to me, anything is possible at this stage of the game.
Anything else that we haven't covered so far?
I know, Greg, to you, when she speaks to you, it's and I think to all of us too, it comes off as very much of a Christian kind of a background, a Christian believer, very active in politics. Judy's this very political animal that's out there and has very strong views on things as well. If you're not sure if you've heard of the group called Concerned Christians or not, it's like a Christian extremist group, but they have a subgroup called Warrior Grannies. Judy's on that group and actually has a handle as the name Minnesota Granny, MN Granny, Min Granny. She's making posts on different forums and whatnot under Warrior Grannies. Would there be any connection to that, for instance, with her political or her belief structure, belief views, that she would be potentially brought into a case like this to help steer it in a certain narrative, to help better those pushing this whole scenario?
I haven't really heard of this group. What are their views?
I think it's
Warriors for Crime. What is it? What is it?
After this, after the whole Patriot Act came out, and these different groups all started popping up all over the place.
Oh, well.
It operates under the guise of being very
big
patriotic and whatnot.
There. Yeah.
That's
I'd be very curious about that right there. Any group just popping up.
All I know is I'm sitting here reading an article in the Grand Forks Herald where it's online, and it states that they're writing, it isn't exactly known when the three died, but the Prochnows believe it was sometime near Christmas. That's when they stopped seeing signs of life in the house. And then Colin says, they quote him as stating, I assumed they had gone somewhere for Christmas. And since Christmas, I shoveled their driveway a couple of times, even though the Crowleys usually shoveled it themselves. The neighbors became suspicious last week when they noticed the same lights on in the home day and night.
That was odd. That was one of the really odd ones. And you have the people who live in the back of the Crowleys, and she said that if there were any lights on, that they would have shined through her bedroom window. So if the lights would have shined through her bedroom window and she didn't see any lights starting in December 22nd, December 23rd, I think, which would line up with what the Crowleys are, or with what the Prochnows are saying here, because they're basically saying that there was no activity since before Christmas. Nothing. No movement.
And I find that so interesting because it's obvious that, well, for me, it's obvious they actually were quite well and alive at Christmas time. Presents were no longer there, so they had to have opened them. There was no sign of wrapping paper, so that got taken away by the trash. So
that would also mean that they did see movement before then, right? So at some point, they did see movement. So I was just curious about kind of narrowing down that date and time.
Yeah, and back to Colin, I'm beginning to wonder if he truly is just someone who, everything like you stated, he really does seem like someone who just doesn't know. And they go on to quote him as stating about the dog, that dog looked thin and he was already skinny to begin with, Prochnow said. Now, here, this is where I knew I'd read it before, that the dog was skinny, the dog is thin. Now, here Judy is also reinforcing the police narrative about how Paleo ate all this part. There's dog food there, dog food available, and not to say dogs don't eat humans when dog food is available, because they do. However, when they do, they're not thin. They're not dehydrated. They're not sickly looking or whatever. So obviously, you would think that this would come across her brain going, okay, well, if my husband and I see the dog and the dog is thinner than he usually is because he's skinny to begin with, and now this dog is thin, I wouldn't jump to say, well, yeah, the dog ate the head.
Mentioning about Colin and Judy both, whether they're both on the same page or not, or one's involved here in some way, shape, or form, and the other's not. That property there at their house, they're part of that resident electronic surveillance program that came about once again after the Patriots Act. Is that something that the husband and wife would both have to sign up for, or is that something that she would have enrolled in? It goes under the acronym of RESD, and they're on that, where they're actually doing electronic surveillance on their neighbors. So who knows if Judy actually does know David Crowley very well and about his activities and his projects because of this program. I know they're paid very good to be enrolled in this program, but is that something that a joint effort needs to be done for a husband and a wife to enroll in this program, or is that something that maybe Colin may not even be aware about himself?
Well, my understanding on these things is that it's usually individual. It does not have to be a husband-wife thing. And somebody can or cannot she doesn't necessarily have to let him know. So whether or not he knows she's part of it, that's a good question. He doesn't have to be told, but they definitely do not have to sign up together. She could be doing this on her own.
Yeah, it's mentioned under on the officer report for John Broughton when he did the interview with Judy. It's mentioned under her name as far as the miscellaneous information about that person, and it's not under his. So, if she is in on that, that certainly could make it certainly interesting if he is an unwitting victim. But when we got the redacted report, that section wasn't redacted, and I think that they would typically redact out something like that on the police report. Is that a program like that? Would that typically be redacted out so they wouldn't be aware of that?
I would think so. That would not be something I would want everybody to know, because I thought for sure with those programs, it's like you can be part of it, but you generally do not announce it. You don't tell everybody, hey, because again, they're to be, I don't know, for lack of a better word, and it's probably not the right word, but spying on everybody, being the nosy neighbor, so to speak, or back in the day was it the TV show Bewitched, where it was Mrs. Kravitz, the nosy neighbor. But yeah, I would think that they would not want it broadcast that that's what they're part of, because the neighbors become suspicious and weary of you. It's like, oh, I think I'm going to kind of stay away from you and be careful what I say and do now that I know what you're doing, because they just don't want to be watched. And I'm not saying her being part of that is a bad thing. I just think it's interesting.
Yeah, well, the big thing for me once again was that 911 call. Reading the transcript, it was the People.com magazine. The online internet article, the comments section, and then all of the various activity on the Justice for David Crowley page and group, and also on YouTube. The overabundance of commentary and response to things, and is most noteworthy, I would say. But yeah, that's all I've got. That's all I've got here for today's.
I agree with you on that, and I think we really should be and I'm glad you point that out, because for someone with supposedly no monkey in the circus, she goes out of her way to create numerous accounts. And when one account is blocked, she creates another, and she creates another, and she's constantly inserting herself in every way she can at every opportunity she can. And my main question to her about that is why? What purpose does that serve her, other than she's very good at throwing out misinformation and disinformation to anyone else who's trying to find out? People who try to ask innocent questions, and then Judy will throw some nasty comments out there, and then they're like, oh, well, thank you for letting us know. And then when she starts to carry on, the people then catch on real quick that she's kind of like a troll in that aspect. Then they start to ignore what she says. But yeah, I find it very curious. Why did she have to go onto Colin's YouTube account to go to our various YouTube channels and write some pretty nasty, derogative stuff? When we have asked her, and I have asked her time and time again just to back off, but she still will continue with again, how many accounts? I think we've lost track of how many accounts she's actually used to insert herself. So what is her agenda? What is her calling in this? And is it more than just the neighbor? It can't be just the neighbor. I mean, I have never known anyone who has inserted themselves so directly and quite so often when they had no connection. She has a connection somehow, but it's not as just a neighbor.
Very interesting indeed. Once again, it's food for thought and grounds for further research. I think just to keep something to keep an eye on. There's no such thing as a coincidence in this case, and what we're seeing here is coincidences all over the place. And I think that what people can do then is leave the comments below with any other questions or commentary. But it's very, very interesting set of circumstances. Let's leave it at that.